Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. We are now moving on to the next unit if you're one of my students, and we'll be talking about the evolution and development of the federal system in place in the United States. Over the course of this video, you should be able to learn how to do all of these things, comparing the differing views regarding the role of the national government. That especially pertains to the period before about 1860 when the Civil War broke out. Also be able to explain the role of the Supreme Court in asserting national supremacy over the states. We've talked about the Supremacy Clause during our Constitution unit already, and now we're going to look a little bit at how that's been applied. Also, be able to describe the evolution from dual federalism to a cooperative federal system in the United States and know the difference between dual federalism and cooperative federalism. I'll give you a hint, it has a little bit of something to do with that cake you just saw on the title slide. Also be able to identify these terms, John Marshall, McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, nullification, and interstate commerce. Alright, let's get started. So we've already talked about the differing views regarding the power of the national government as it pertained to the writing of the Constitution, but it's important to remember that even after the Constitution was ratified and became the law of the land in the 1780s, the debate continued over how strong the national government should be relative to the states, and there were really two camps on this debate. The first was advocated by the Federalists. This is the political party that advocated for a stronger national government. They're obviously associated with the Federalists who had advocated for the Constitution in the first place in the 1780s. And the main Federalist was Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury and kind of the father of America's financial system. And his position was that the national government had been created by the people, and the national government's primary role was to do things that ensured the general welfare, like raise an army and coin money and all of that. So as a result of all that, the federal government, or the national government, should be supreme over the states. The opposite viewpoint was taken by what were once known as the Anti-Federalists, which sort of morphed into the Democratic Republicans, the opposing political party to the Federalists in the 1790s. And that was the states' rights viewpoint. The people who advocated for states' rights, among them Thomas Jefferson, who you see pictured there on the bottom, was that the nation was created by cooperation among the states. And the states together sort of cobbled this nation from 13 separate parts into one body. So as a result, the states were supreme, and these states could, if they chose to do so, operate independently of the national government and maybe in extreme cases even break away from the national government. Now the Supreme Court had different viewpoints on this, but this debate raged throughout the early years of American history, and of course came to a head during the Civil War when 11 states did break away from the Union, or attempted to do so, I should say. Perhaps the most powerful voice when it came to asserting the power of the national government over the states was that of John Marshall. John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the United States for 34 years, from 1801 until his death in 1835. And during his tenure as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court handed down several rulings that asserted and strengthened the power of the national government. If you're one of my students, we've already talked a little bit about Marbury versus Madison, which was decided in 1803, which gave the Supreme Court the right of judicial review. Two cases in particular, though, expand federal authority over the states. The first is McCulloch versus Maryland, which was decided in 1819. This case centered around the Bank of the United States, which had been chartered in 1816 and had branches throughout the country. And the state of Maryland attempted to levy a tax on the national bank within the city of Baltimore, because Maryland had a state law that said that any bank that had not been chartered by the state of Maryland was subject to being taxed. And James McCulloch, who was the cashier of the Bank of the United States in Baltimore, refused to pay the tax, and the state of Maryland prosecuted him for this refusal to pay the tax, and he was convicted. And it got appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that the state of Maryland could not tax the national bank. The court ruled that the government of the United States had the power to establish a national bank because of the necessary and proper clause. They said even though it's not specifically in the Constitution that you can create a national bank, the Constitution does give the government the power to coin money and levy taxes, so they need a bank in order to do that. And you can't tax them because if you tax them, you could, in theory, weaken them to the point of destroying it. The exact quote was, "The power to tax is the power to destroy." So states do not have the right to interfere with this national obligation that is creating the national bank. The other case that asserts federal authority is Gibbons versus Ogden, which was decided in 1824. Very briefly, we're not going to go into as much detail on this one, but it gave the government the power to regulate interstate commerce. That's commerce that or business that is conducted between more than one state, or when goes across state lines. In this case, the court held that a law passed in New York regulating steamboat lines, which were used to ship goods, could not apply to a steamboat line that ran between New York and New Jersey because more than one state was involved. So one state really can't pass laws that affects commerce in another state. So both the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause are invoked by the martial court in asserting federal authority. Other debates regarding federal versus state authority centered around the idea of nullification. Nullification was the ability of a state to declare a national law null and void within its borders. So if a state didn't like a federal law, they could just say, well, we're not going to follow that law within our state. Now, states' rights advocates thought this was a power that the states had, and federalists, or people who favored a more strong national government, didn't think the states had this right. So there were quite a few debates over this. It was first pushed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the 1790s in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were documents that they drafted opposing a federal law passed in 1798 called the Sedition Act, which essentially threatened to throw newspaper editors who criticized the government in jail. And Jefferson and Madison were saying that those states, Virginia and Kentucky, shouldn't have to follow those laws if they didn't want to. It popped up again in the 1830s when John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who at the time was actually the Vice President of the United States, threatened to have South Carolina nullify a tariff or a tax on imported goods that was hurting business within the state of South Carolina. And he actually went as far as to say that South Carolina should be able to secede from the Union and just break away entirely if they wanted to. The president at the time was Andrew Jackson, who didn't really agree with that, to the point of sending warships into Charleston Harbor, threatening to send the military in and hang John C. Calhoun and anyone else who advocated for nullification. So that kind of put that whole stink down. But of course, the idea of nullification came to a head in 1860 when all these states began to secede from the Union at the outset of the Civil War. And the Civil War served to once and for all settle this debate, that being, can states nullify laws or break away from the United States if they no longer want to be part of the Union? And the Civil War decides no, they can't. There's a Supreme Court case in 1869 called Texas versus White. We're not going to go into the specifics of the case in this video, but essentially the Supreme Court upheld that Texas voluntarily joined a union that was indissoluble, and they never left. They said they seceded, but they never had, and secession and nullification are officially illegal, according to the Supreme Court. So as you can see, there was plenty of resentment between the national government and some of the states, and still quite a bit of debate over, who got to do what and what government was supreme and all of that. And so what you began to see from the end of the Civil War up until about 1930 in the United States was a concept of dual federalism, which is where the national government has their areas that they oversee, such as the raising of the national military and the coining of money and all of that, and they're supreme in that area. And then the states are supreme in their areas, which are their reserve powers guaranteed by the 10th Amendment. And really, ne'er the twain shall meet. They don't do a whole lot, alongside each other or in cooperation with each other. This is referred to as of the 1960s as layer cake federalism, because you have these two layers of government, national and state, and there's a very fine line of division, that being the tasty frosting. And they don't, again, come together, really. This really begins to change in the 1930s with the Great Depression. Because during the Great Depression, really for the first time, the federal government began providing aid to the states and the people who live within them, as a result of horrible economic times, very high unemployment, and all of that. So this ushers in the age of what we call cooperative federalism, which is where the national government and state governments essentially are forced to interact with or cooperate with each other in order to implement various programs and policies. This is usually accomplished through grants in aid given to the states, where the federal government gives money to states for a particular purpose, and the national government as a result can hold the states to certain conditions and force them to pass or adhere to certain laws. And we're going to be talking a lot more about that during this unit if you're one of my students. This is called marble cake federalism, where the delicious chocolate and the savory vanilla swirl together, and the lines are no longer as distinct. So they have to cooperate with one another. This continues well through the 20th century. It has sort of abated in the last quarter century or so, but it was a very prevalent aspect of the federal system in the United States from the Great Depression on through the 1970s. But again, that's for another day. That will do it for today. As always, feel free to ask me if you have any questions. Cheers!